Welcome to week 3 of your SCI course. This week is called Building Connections Among Homes, Communities, and Schools. And as you'll see on our course map here, this week will be an extension of what we started talking about last week when we worked on learning about the diversity among English language learners. This week we'll build right from that as we talk about families of English language learners, their experiences in our schools, and how we can build more supportive relationships between schools, teachers, and families. Here are our session objectives for this week. First, we'll explain how home, family, community, linguistic, and cultural practices may support academic literacy practices in the U.S. Then we'll explain the importance of outreach to families and understand strategies for communication that are linguistically and culturally relevant. And finally, we'll apply knowledge of attitudes, practices, and strategies for creating a culturally inclusive and welcoming classroom environment. Here's our agenda. We'll start off by talking about some common assumptions about family engagement, as well as some barriers, some real barriers that exist to family involvement, but we'll actually dismantle those barriers. Then we'll talk more deeply about the family's role in language and literacy development, and finally some best practices in family engagement that you can take and apply directly to your work with students and families. We'll do a wrap-up and next steps, and after you finish this lecture, you'll go into Blackboard and complete the online module, which includes a variety of activities for you to do to reflect on what you learned during this lecture and in the readings from this week. Different from last week, there's only this one lecture. You won't watch videos throughout the online session. You'll just watch this one and then go into Blackboard, and it will guide you through the steps of the activities. Okay, so we're going to start out by addressing some assumptions about family engagement among the families of English language learners. We'll talk about the common assumptions and biases that schools, teachers, and other folks may have, specifically about immigrant families. And then we'll talk about what you as teachers can do to challenge those assumptions. I want to read this scenario with you, this teacher comment. This came from the one of the Trumbull and Pacheco readings that you've done. And I want you to think about whether you've heard anyone in your school, any colleagues, any other staff sharing similar sentiments. I feel so bad for these kids. The parents don't come to parent-teacher conferences. I've never seen any at open houses either. I don't think they really try to help the kids in school. I wonder, maybe in their culture, education isn't as important. Have you heard this or something like it in your school environment? How did it make you feel? What did you do in this situation? What could you do if you face this situation in the future? There are a lot of reasons why teachers and schools have assumptions like these or have biases like these towards immigrant families. But instead of jumping to conclusions like this, it's important for teachers and schools to really seek to understand where their families are coming from, to ask questions like, what are some possible reasons why parents may not have participated in the conferences or open house? Oftentimes, many immigrant families are working long hours, working multiple jobs to support their family and improve their financial situation. Often, in some cases, immigrant families may not feel comfortable coming to the school environment. They may not have had welcoming experiences before. They may feel nervous about whether they'll be able to understand teachers and school staff if they don't share a common language. There's many reasons why this could be the case. that have nothing to do with the level of priority that families place on education. So what types of questions could this particular teacher ask herself or others to gain insight into parents' beliefs regarding their participation in school? How could she find out more so that she truly understands where these families are coming from and therefore able to make better connections with them? Finally, it's important for her and for other teachers to think about what ways families are participating in their child's education. There are probably many ways that families are supporting education that the teacher has no way to know about. What kinds of messages are families sending to children about education in the home? What types of learning is happening regularly in the home? There could be so many ways that families are showing their support that teachers won't know about unless they ask and they seek to understand at a deeper level. Take a moment and reflect on some of your own assumptions you've made about families of your students, and assumptions that others around you have made. We've all made assumptions, whether we consciously realize it or not. How have you been able to address these assumptions for yourself and for others? You can pause the video here, take some time to reflect on this, jot down some notes if it's helpful, and then continue with the lecture. Now we're going to dive a little more deeply into some of the actual barriers to involvement. Because there certainly are some common barriers to school involvement for immigrant families, and we started touching on those when we addressed the assumptions. But as we mentioned, there are ways that schools and teachers can seek to better understand these barriers and consequently help break them down to facilitate more family engagement. So I'm going to walk through 6 different factors, 6 different types of barriers that limit family involvement or tend to limit family involvement. So there are contextual factors, things that are going on around the family and the school. This could involve lack of time because, again, maybe families are working multiple jobs, have other commitments, or the school schedule may be so inflexible they don't have opportunities for meeting times during hours in which the family is available to come in. Families may have difficulty finding childcare if they have young children at home, or transportation to get to the school in the first place. So all of these outside contextual factors can easily contribute to families feeling uncomfortable coming to the school and not actually being able to show up. Secondly, there are language barriers, of course. Many of our immigrant families and families of ELLs speak a language other than English, and they may have varying levels of comfort speaking in English. Some of them may feel comfortable trying, they may have a little bit of English proficiency, others may not. And especially if school staff, teachers, office staff are not proficient in families' home languages and ways of communicating, it can be very uncomfortable for families to come in and talk with their child's teachers. Thirdly, there are differences in cultural beliefs about the role that families play and the role that schools play in supporting students. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but whereas in American culture here, we believe very strongly that families should be involved in their students' education, they should come to the school, they should ask questions, they should come to family conferences and advocate for their students. There are many cultures in which that type of family involvement is not the norm or expected, and in fact, families expect and revere the teachers as the ones who are taking charge of their children's education when they're in the school, and so sometimes they leave that school realm to the teacher as a way of respecting their role. So that can be very different between families and schools. Additionally, there can be a lack of understanding. Oftentimes, families, especially families of immigrants, aren't familiar with school practices, aren't familiar with school policies. They may not understand when they're able or expected to come into school. They may not understand other policies related to their students' rights or testing or you name it. And on the other side, on the flip side of that, there's often a lack of understanding on the part of the school about families' beliefs and practices and cultures. And so this general sort of mismatch and lack of understanding on both sides can lead to real challenges in forming strong relationships. Lack of knowledge can be another barrier. And in this case, when I'm talking about knowledge, I'm talking about the actual content of schooling. And what students are learning in the classroom. So I'm sure you've heard from many families comments about how it's difficult for them to help their students with homework. Perhaps they, again, there's the language barrier. They don't understand the English in order to support on homework, but they also may have, they may be unable to help with the content of the homework. Perhaps they didn't learn the content that their children are learning, their education level may be different, or there may simply be differences in the ways certain skills and content are taught. I remember when I started teaching newcomers in Lawrence, and most of my newcomers are from the Dominican Republic, and my second year teaching, I taught math, and I was doing some beginning division, and sent homework home with my students, and had them and some of their families come back and say, I'm not sure, what this is. I've never seen this before. And at first I was a little confused because I was assuming it was just, standard operations, division is common, whether you're speaking Spanish or English. But as I learned more and talked to the families, I realized that the way they teach division in the Dominican Republic was different from the way we teach it in the United States. So whereas we would do a problem like this, 56 divided by 8 is 7, in the Dominican Republic, they teach it like this. 56 divided by 8 equals 7. And so it looks very, very different. And so when I sent home problems like this, families were confused and students were confused. When I sent home problems like this, families were confused. And so, I realized very quickly that it wasn't that they didn't know how to do division, but it was that they had learned it differently. And if teachers aren't able or willing to ask those kinds of questions, then they're not really going to understand what the challenges are and what the barriers are to involvement. Because the families of my children were eager and thrilled to help their students with math homework. They just needed the bridge from me to help them figure out how to help their students. And finally, the last bucket of barriers to family involvement is exclusion and discrimination. And certainly we don't like to think that this is happening in our schools, but it certainly is in places. Sometimes school staff can be discriminatory towards families, or even other parents who had parent organizations and committees. And this can absolutely make immigrant families feel like they're not welcome to be involved in their schools. There's a great book called Beyond the Bake Sale. It's by Henderson. It was published in 2007. It's about family involvement in schools in general, not just with immigrant families. And they have this rubric that you can use to do a self-assessment of your own school and determine how friendly, how open is your school to family engagement. What is the level of true partnership that school and family can have. I've done this before in schools that I've worked with, and it's been really illuminating to see how the practices and daily interactions in the school, daily policies, can really affect family partnerships. You'll have some options in your assignments when you go in the online module, but one of the options is to actually look at this rubric and do a self-assessment of your own school to see how high these barriers are for family involvement. So I definitely recommend checking that out. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the family's role in language and literacy and language learning. Because certainly families play a very, very important role in supporting language and literacy development at home, regardless of what language they speak. They can provide support in L1, the native language, and also L2 sometimes. And so there are ways that you as teachers can support families in supporting their own children. But sometimes families don't know what questions to ask, and we as teachers don't know exactly what to tell them, so that they feel like they have concrete solutions and tools that they can use. In order for us to do this, in order for us to help our families help our students, it's really important that we as teachers see the way that families, communities, and schools overlap. And each of these groups has its own area of expertise that we need to draw on and we need to see as expertise. So families, first and foremost, are the principal experts in their children. They know their children better than anyone else. They have their own goals for their children. They know their children's interests and strengths, and they have an idea, or they can tell you how they want to be involved. So it's really important we recognize that families can provide this wealth of information and wealth of expertise about their children. Similarly, communities have a wide variety of resources and expertise that we can draw from. We can learn from the cultural resources within the community. Often there are a variety of external organizations and resources available for families and children within the communities, and making bridges between the school and community organizations, community cultural groups can be really powerful in helping to engage families. And schools or teachers in schools have an area of expertise too. They have expertise in school policies and practice, academics, school expectations, services the school can provide to support children, whether they're learning English, whether they have a disability, whether they're struggling in other ways. And schools also can share information about students' rights. And it's important for all three of these parties to be working together and to really be kind of focusing on this point of overlap, because they can all bring their expertise to the table in order to really serve children most effectively. But if they each continue to operate in their own silos, they're not going to be able to best support students. And bottom line, it's important for us to realize that all three of these groups have the same common goals, and that's supporting children to develop into adults who will fulfill their potential and contribute to society. So once we start from a place where we realize that we are all sharing the same goals, we are better able to work together to collaborate more effectively for students. So I'm going to walk through some of the myths that we see about family support and families' role in literacy and language development, and dispel those myths with some research. So we'll talk through the reality of each of these areas. So first one is this assumption that immigrant or low-income families provide few literacy or academic learning opportunities at home, and there's little they can do at home to support student learning. There certainly is research that shows that students who grow up in low-income families, non-English speaking families, don't have the exposure to the rich English language environments that wealthier English speaking children do, and that can impact their start to schooling. However, we need to realize that there is, regardless of what language is happening in the home, there are many rich opportunities for student learning and student language development when children are growing up. And so immigrant families, speaking their native language, use it for a variety of purposes. They may use it for religious purposes, for example, reading the Bible together. They may use their native language and or English in other types of family tasks, such as shopping, entertainment, work, legal, medical engagements. And for many immigrant families, many English language learners, children are often called upon to translate for their families in different types of interactions, even, at the doctor's office, at a lawyer's office, and that's really sophisticated language that students are using as they're doing that translation. And so really there are many, many, many types of language opportunities happening in the home as children grow up, and it's important that we recognize those as strengths. So this idea that immigrant families don't provide literacy or language opportunities in the home is a myth and definitely busted. Another myth or another assumption that you may often hear is that it's more beneficial for families to use English in the home than the native language. This is sometimes an assumption that families have when they come to the United States. They think, okay, my child needs to learn English and they need to learn it as quickly as possible, so I need to immerse them in English all the time. And so I need to learn English myself. I need to practice it in the home. I shouldn't use my native language because that won't facilitate their English development. There's a lot of research that shows this is, quite frankly, not true. Cummins is a second language acquisition theorist who we'll talk a lot more about in the next couple weeks. But he has this theory of common underlying proficiency, which is this idea that if you develop proficiency in your native language, there are skills and elements of that language that will transfer to a second language. So proficiency in first language transfers to proficiency in second language. And so what follows from that is the idea that the more you continue to grow and develop in your native language, the stronger your second language acquisition will be. And so it's important for families to know that the more they continue using their native language at home and growing their children's ability in native language, then research shows that their students will have higher achievement and academic performance in the second language, in English. And so we need to really encourage our families to continue using native language at home as much as possible. Bottom line is the most important factor in home literacy experience. The most important factor is home literacy experience. Kids need to be exposed to language, oral language, written language, and have their families really prioritize and place value on literacy activities, regardless of the language. Doesn't matter what language they're happening in, it's just important that they're happening. So, this myth busted. On the flip side of that, some families and some folks believe that families should only use the native language at home and let schools focus on English, especially if families' English is not strong. So certainly while we just showed that continuing to have families use L1 at home and building that is beneficial, that's not to say that families should never use English at home. There have been some studies that show that for bilingual students, some more English use in the home is associated with higher English achievement, particularly when we're thinking about oral language. And there's some correlation between home literacy practices and school literacy outcomes in a particular language. But it's unclear as whether this is a correlation or causation. And one of the important factors to consider is the family's comfort level and proficiency level in English. So if the family feels particularly comfortable and proficient in English, then it could be really powerful for them to be using more English at home. But if they're not comfortable with English, if it's not an area of strength, then it's likely more beneficial for them to be continuing to use and prioritize their native language at home. So this one's a little more complicated, but in general, myth busted. We can't take any of these as absolutes. There's lots of nuance, and it's important for us to help to understand them as teachers and to also help families understand them as well. Finally, there can be this assumption that schools need to focus on the differences between home and school in order to overcome them. In other words, being aware of how home culture is different from school culture will help schools bridge those differences more effectively. One example of this is the difference between the difference that cultures may have in terms of how they perceive the role of the teacher. So, as we talked about a little bit earlier, there's this commonly held belief in the United States that the parent is the child's first teacher. The parent has responsibility for jump-starting learning for their children, and in that same vein, we expect families to be involved in their students' education, to come into classrooms, to come to conferences, because they should play this very active role. On the flip side to that, popular cultural belief in many Latin American countries is that the teacher is the child's second mother, so that families feel comfortable when children are school-aged entrusting teachers with the care and the education of their children. And so they revere, they trust teachers, and don't have the same expectations about coming into schools, sharing their ideas or their advice, because they trust the teacher to own that. So that can be a very, very real difference. And rather than focus on just those differences, research actually suggests that, it's important to be aware of these differences, important to be aware of these discontinuities in cultures, but not focus on them too much, because too much focus could really undermine the potential for partnerships. We can more effectively bridge these discontinuities by recognizing similarities, by recognizing those points of overlap and those commonly held beliefs and goals that we all share. So if we can realize that we, as teachers, share the same goals as families, valuing schooling, seeing it as the key to economic success, holding high aspirations for student achievements, we all share those same beliefs. We can use those similarities as a place of starting to build partnerships. And we should really identify families' funds of knowledge, to go back to the Mohe and Hinchman article from last week, and see those strengths that they bring to the table. So we're not going to focus on differences so much. We're gonna focus on similarities, focus on commonly held beliefs. Again, busted. All right. So to close out, we're going to sort of synthesize some of the best practices in family engagement. We're going to talk about taking a strengths-based approach to working with families, give you a chance through the online module to analyze effective programs and synthesize some of those best practices. So as we've been saying throughout this lecture, we really, really need to take a strengths-based approach to support our families. And that mindset is going to help us overcome barriers to family involvement. So as teachers, we need to focus on families' strengths, their funds of knowledge, their social and cultural capital, and their characteristics of resilience. We need to really recognize what they bring to the table and build from that, because there's so many positive things that families have that we can learn from that will help us better educate their children. So here's some key takeaways about best practices in family engagement with immigrant families and ELLs. First, cultivate ongoing opportunities to interact with family members informally and personally. Do you have opportunities at pickup or drop off before or after school to chat with families? Do you make phone calls home just to check in and tell families that their students had a great day? It's important to be flexible, very flexible with scheduling. So if families can't come in during the school day, are you able to stay after school? Are you able to come in before school so that they're able to have meetings with teachers? In holding family conferences, it can be helpful to have a couple of different days that offer families opportunities at different times. So sometimes an afternoon conference block, an evening conference block, a morning conference block, to allow as many families as possible to participate. It's important to be flexible about role expectations and take cues from parents about what is comfortable. So as you're getting to know families and building relationships from them, take cues from them and try to figure out what they're comfortable with, what they might have questions about, and adjust your own role in your interaction with them based on what you learn. It can also be really helpful to work closely with paraprofessionals, school volunteers from the community, and community-based organizations. As we said before, community organizations are often tremendous resources for families and tremendous resources about the community, help you learn more about the community and how to best connect with families. Conduct regular outreach to families. So this, I think you are all familiar with this and why it's so important, but the more you talk to families, the better you'll be able to build relationships, the more comfortable they'll feel with you and you with them. And so if you can make positive phone calls home a couple a day and ensure that you're talking with each family at least every couple weeks, you'll be able to build stronger relationships with them. Engage in ethnography. So ethnography being the idea that you learn as much as you can about who your families are, where they're coming from, what their immigration story is, what their life is like. The more you learn, the better you'll get to know them, and the better you'll be able to understand the strengths that they bring and the challenges or barriers they might face. But truly operate as a learner with an open mind. And all of these practices will help you approach family engagement with that real strengths-based mindset. So as you go through the online module and you finish up with this week's assignments, I want you to really think about your own experiences working with families and reflect on what it's been like. Reflect on these questions. What is one of your areas of strength in engaging with your students' families? What's something you've tried that's worked really well that you could share with other colleagues? What's been a challenge you faced in engaging your students' families? And what are some assumptions you may hold about those families? Finally, and most importantly, what's your commitment moving forward to ensuring that you can engage all families more effectively? So I want you just to have those reflections in the back of your mind as you complete this week's assignments in Blackboard. And to wrap up, here are our next steps. So again, as you close out this video, please go into Blackboard and complete the activities and assignments there. I ask that you have those complete by 11:59 p.m. on Friday, 2/20. That'll give you an opportunity to react and respond with your original posts on the discussion board and also respond to at least one colleague. So I recommend that you complete the module and post your original responses in advance of that Friday deadline. And then finally, for week 4, presuming the snow gods are in our favor, we will meet in person on Tuesday, 2/24, and we'll talk about second language acquisition theory. So each of the sections has your own reading, also on your syllabus, and there will be a week 4 discussion post up soon. So I will keep you posted about that, but please look for it. And don't hesitate to reach out with any questions over email. Thanks so much. Hope you have a great February vacation.